I stood at the altar in a dress I would never wear, holding a bouquet of white roses that were already beginning to wilt in my trembling hands, when my phone buzzed with a photograph of my fiancé kissing another woman on a beach in Santorini, the caption reading, "Finally free," and that was the exact moment I understood that the man I had loved for 6 years had not simply been late to our wedding, he had run from it entirely, taking with him my mistress of a best friend and every plan we had ever made together. Before I go any further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet power of hope, and in the idea that broken people can still find second chances, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one mean so much more when they reach the people who need them, and our community grows stronger every time someone new joins us looking for a little bit of light. Now, let me tell you what happened to me, because I promise you, this story does not end where you think it will. My name is Clara Whitfield, and on the morning of what should have been the happiest day of my life, I was 31 years old, standing in the bridal suite of the Ashworth Manor with my mother fussing over the buttons on the back of my gown, my 3 bridesmaids giggling over champagne, and 200 guests filling the garden outside with their soft laughter and the smell of fresh peonies. I had planned every detail of that wedding myself, from the hand-lettered place cards to the string quartet that would play as I walked down the aisle, because I believed, with the kind of naive certainty that only comes from genuinely trusting someone, that Julian Marsh was the love of my life. We had been together since graduate school, when he was studying finance and I was studying architecture, and he used to tell me that watching me sketch buildings was like watching someone fall in love with the world. I believed every word of it. I believed it so completely that I never once suspected that the woman standing beside me as my maid of honor, my closest friend since childhood, a woman named Vivian Cole, had been sharing hotel rooms with him for the better part of a year. The wedding coordinator came to find me 20 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin, her face pale in a way that made my stomach drop before she even spoke. She told me that the groom could not be located, that his best man had tried his phone a dozen times with no answer, and that his car was gone from the parking lot. I remember laughing, actually laughing, because my mind refused to accept what my body already seemed to understand, some instinct deep in my bones that told me this was not a delay, this was an ending. I walked out of that suite in my wedding dress, past 200 guests who fell silent as I passed, and I found my father standing near the garden gate with his phone in his hand and an expression I had never seen on him before, a mixture of rage and heartbreak that made him look 10 years older in an instant. He turned the phone toward me without a word, and there it was, the photograph that would end my old life and, though I did not know it yet, begin a new one. Julian, in a linen shirt, sun-kissed and smiling, his arm wrapped around Vivian's waist, the caption beneath it announcing their engagement as though the two of them had not just detonated a bomb in the middle of my entire world. I will not pretend that I handled it with grace. I did not. I remember very little of the next several hours except fragments, the sound of my mother sobbing into the shoulder of a stranger, the feeling of 200 pairs of eyes on me as I walked back through the garden in reverse, the strange numbness that settled over me like a fog as I peeled the veil from my hair with hands that did not feel like my own. My father, a proud and quiet man who owned a shipping company on the eastern seaboard, said only one thing to me that day that I have never forgotten. He said that some betrayals were not accidents of the heart, they were choices made by cowards who lacked the decency to be honest, and that I would survive this because I came from people who did not break, we only bent, and then we stood back up. I did not believe him that day. I believed him much later, but not that day. What made the humiliation so much sharper was that Julian Marsh was not simply my fiancé, he was also the nephew of one of my father's oldest business rivals, a cold and calculating man named Reginald Ashcombe, and our wedding had been intended, in part, to finally bridge a decades-long feud between two shipping families that had been undercutting each other in ports up and down the coast since before I was born. My father had hoped that my marriage to Julian would soften old wounds and open new opportunities. Instead, Julian's betrayal did not just break my heart, it humiliated my father publicly and reopened every old wound between our families, because now it looked as though the Ashcombes had used us, taken what benefit they could from the association, and then discarded us the moment something better came along. My father did not say this to me in anger. He said it with a kind of exhausted grief that hurt me more than fury ever could have. For, it began, strangely enough, with a phone call from a man named Julian Marsh's own family had spent years trying to destroy in the shipping business, a man my father had taught me since childhood to think of as an adversary, if not an outright enemy. His name was Nathaniel Graves, and he was the CEO of Graves Maritime, a company that had been locked in bitter competition with the Ashcombe family's shipping empire for nearly 15 years, a rivalry so old and so entrenched that I had grown up hearing his name spoken in our house the way one might speak of a storm on the horizon, something to be watched, respected, and avoided. I had met Nathaniel exactly twice before that year, both times at industry functions where we exchanged nothing more than polite, distant nods, because our family's companies were locked in a decades-long war over shipping contracts along the eastern seaboard, a war so bitter that my father once told me he would rather lose an entire fleet than shake Nathaniel Graves' hand in a business deal. So when my assistant told me that Nathaniel Graves himself was on the phone asking to speak with me personally, 3 weeks after my wedding collapsed, I assumed it was some kind of business maneuver, an attempt to exploit my family's public humiliation for competitive advantage. I almost did not take the call. I am grateful, more grateful than I can express, that I did. Nathaniel's voice on the phone was quiet and measured, nothing like the cold, calculating businessman my father had described to me over the years. He told me he had heard what happened, that all of the shipping community had heard, because these things travel fast in small, competitive worlds, and that he was calling not as a rival to my father, but simply as a person who had also once been humiliated in a very public way, and who understood something of what I might be feeling. He told me, with a kind of raw honesty I did not expect from a man I had been taught to think of as ruthless, that his own marriage had ended 3 years earlier when his wife left him for his former business partner, a betrayal that had cost him not only his marriage but very nearly his company, since the partner had attempted to use insider knowledge to poach half of Graves Maritime's clients on his way out the door. He said he was not calling to offer pity, because pity was useless and he knew it. He was calling because he wanted me to know that survival was possible, that the humiliation would not last forever even though it felt permanent right now, and that if I ever wanted to talk to someone who genuinely understood, without any agenda, he was available. Then he said something that stayed with me for a long time afterward. He said that our families had spent 15 years treating each other as enemies over shipping contracts and market share, but that grief did not care about family feuds, and neither did he. I did not call him back for 2 weeks. Part of me was suspicious, trained by years of my father's warnings to distrust anything that came from the Graves family, and part of me was simply too raw to speak to anyone at all, let alone a near stranger. But there was something about the way he had spoken, the complete absence of performance in his voice, that lingered in my mind during the long, quiet days when I sat in the garden doing nothing at all. Eventually, on an afternoon when the loneliness had become so heavy I could hardly breathe under the weight of it, I called him back, mostly because I could not think of anyone else in the world who might understand, and because everyone else's sympathy had begun to feel like something I had to perform gratitude for, while his felt like something I did not have to perform anything for at all. We talked for 2 hours that first call, and I will tell you honestly that I had expected the conversation to be awkward, given everything standing between our families, but it was not. Nathaniel Graves turned out to be nothing like the man I had been raised to imagine. He was 40 years old, a widower's son who had taken over his family's company at 26 after his own father's sudden death, and he spoke about his failed marriage with a kind of unflinching honesty that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, that I was not alone in the particular shame of having trusted the wrong person completely. He told me about the year after his divorce, how he had thrown himself so completely into rebuilding his company that he had nearly worked himself into the ground, how he had stopped sleeping properly and started drinking more than he should have, until his younger sister, a woman named Cordelia who ran a small but successful winery in the countryside, had shown up at his office unannounced one day and refused to leave until he agreed to see a therapist. He told me this last part almost sheepishly, as though admitting to therapy were still a kind of vulnerability he was not entirely used to sharing, and something about that vulnerability, coming from a man my whole family had spent years describing as cold and ruthless, cracked something open in me. We spoke again the next week, and then the week after that, our conversations growing longer and less guarded each time, until it became a quiet, steady rhythm in the middle of an otherwise shapeless grief, something I found myself looking forward to in a way that both comforted and unsettled me. My father was, understandably, alarmed when he learned that I had been speaking with Nathaniel Graves. He came to my bedroom one evening, his face tight with the particular worry of a parent who has already watched his child be hurt once and cannot bear the thought of it happening again, and he asked me, with more gentleness than I expected, whether I understood what I was doing, speaking with a man from a family that had spent 15 years trying to undercut our business at every turn. I told him honestly that I did not fully understand it myself, only that Nathaniel had been kind to me when kindness was in short supply, and that after everything that had happened with Julian, I no longer trusted my own judgment enough to declare with any certainty who was truly an enemy and who was not. My father did not argue with me further that night, though I could see the worry had not left his eyes, and I understood that his caution came not from cruelty but from love, the particular fierce love of a father who had already watched the wrong man break his daughter's heart in front of 200 witnesses. The turning point, if I can call it that, came about 2 months after the wedding that never happened, when my father's company suffered a serious setback. One of our largest cargo ships had run into mechanical failure off the coast, stranding a shipment of goods that represented a significant portion of our quarterly contracts, and worse, our primary backup vessel was already committed elsewhere. It was, by any measure, a disaster, the kind of logistical crisis that could cost my father's company not only money but the trust of major clients who depended on reliable delivery. I learned about it the way everyone else did, through a tense, hushed conversation between my father and his operations manager at our kitchen table, my father's face gray with the particular exhaustion of a man watching decades of careful work threatened by circumstances entirely outside his control. I do not know what made me do what I did next, except perhaps that I had spent 2 months learning, through my conversations with Nathaniel, that the line between enemy and ally was often much thinner and more arbitrary than I had been raised to believe. I called him. I told him about the stranded shipment, the tight timeline, the clients who would very likely take their business elsewhere if the delivery could not be salvaged, and I asked him, my heart pounding with the audacity of the request, whether Graves Maritime might have a vessel available to help. There was a long silence on the phone, long enough that I nearly apologized and hung up, certain I had overstepped in some unforgivable way. But then Nathaniel said, quietly, that he had one ship that could be redirected within the day, and that he would make the arrangements personally. I asked him why he would help a company that had been his family's rival for 15 years, and he said something I have carried with me ever since. He said that rivalries were things men built to protect their pride, but that pride had never once kept a ship afloat or a family together, and that he had learned, the hard way, that there was very little point in holding on to anger that served no one and healed nothing. He redirected the vessel that same afternoon, at what I later learned was a significant cost to his own company's schedule, and he did it without asking for anything in return, without a single word of the deal-making or leverage my father had always warned me the Graves family specialized in. My father's shipment was saved, his clients retained, and when he finally learned who had made it possible, I watched something shift in his face, a lifetime of assumption cracking slightly under the weight of an inconvenient, undeniable kindness. My father invited Nathaniel to our home for dinner not long after that, a meeting that I suspect cost both men a great deal of pride to agree to, given everything standing between their families. I remember the strange, charged quiet of that evening, my mother fussing nervously over a menu she had changed 3 times, my father pacing the study before Nathaniel's car even arrived. But when Nathaniel walked through our door, he did something I had not expected. He apologized, plainly and without excessive ceremony, for every underhanded contract negotiation his family's company had pursued against ours over the years, acknowledging that some of it had crossed lines that should not have been crossed, and he said that he did not expect forgiveness for 15 years of rivalry in a single evening, but that he hoped, in time, we might find a way to see each other as something other than adversaries. My father, who I had never in my life seen back down from a grudge, sat across from him at our dinner table and, after a long moment, extended his hand. It was not friendship yet, not that night, but it was the beginning of something, a small crack of light in a wall that had stood between our families for a decade and a half. Over the following months, Nathaniel and I continued to grow closer, our relationship shifting slowly from two wounded strangers offering each other comfort into something neither of us had quite the courage to name at first. He was patient with me in a way Julian had never been, never once pressuring me to move faster than I was ready to, never once making me feel as though my grief over the wedding that never happened was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a wound to be honored. He would come by on quiet weekend afternoons and simply sit with me in the garden, sometimes talking, sometimes not, and I found that his silence was as comfortable to me as his conversation, which felt like its own kind of miracle after months of feeling as though I could not trust silence at all, since silence was exactly what had been hiding Julian and Vivian's betrayal from me for the better part of a year. It was not, I want to be honest with you, an easy road. There were nights when the old wound reopened without warning, when I would see a photograph online of Julian and Vivian at some glamorous event, looking impossibly happy, and I would spiral back into the particular shame of having been discarded so publicly, so completely, by two people I had trusted with my whole heart. On one of those nights, months into my growing friendship with Nathaniel, I called him in tears, apologizing even as I did it, certain that I was burdening him with feelings he had no obligation to carry. He drove to my parents' house within the hour, arriving well past dark, the only true nighttime moment in this entire story, and he sat with me on the porch steps while I cried, not offering empty reassurances or telling me to move on, but simply saying that the wound made sense, that betrayal like that did not heal on a schedule, and that he would keep showing up for as long as it took, whether that was months or years. It was on that porch, in the quiet dark, that I first understood I was not simply healing alongside Nathaniel Graves, I had fallen in love with him, slowly and without any of the breathless drama that had characterized my relationship with Julian, but with a depth that felt more solid, more real, than anything I had known before. There was, of course, one more obstacle standing between us, and it came, as these things often do, in the form of an unexpected confrontation. Reginald Ashcombe, Julian's uncle and my father's oldest rival, learned of my growing relationship with Nathaniel Graves and, rather than allowing the old feud to quietly fade, chose to escalate it. He called a meeting of several major shipping clients under the pretense of a routine industry gathering, and used the occasion to spread rumors that my father's company was colluding improperly with Graves Maritime, suggesting that our family's sudden association was evidence of price-fixing or unethical coordination designed to squeeze smaller competitors out of the market. It was a vicious, calculated move, clearly intended to punish both families for the embarrassment Julian's own behavior had caused, redirecting blame outward rather than accepting that his nephew's cruelty was the true source of the scandal. For a tense week, both my father's company and Nathaniel's faced the very real threat of losing major contracts as clients grew wary of the rumors, and I watched Nathaniel handle the crisis with a steadiness that only deepened my love and respect for him. Rather than retaliating with equally underhanded tactics, as I suspect his father might have done in earlier years, Nathaniel called for a transparent, independent audit of both companies' dealings, inviting the very clients Reginald had tried to frighten away to review the books themselves. The audit revealed exactly what Nathaniel had promised it would: no collusion, no impropriety, simply two former rivals who had found, through painful and unlikely circumstances, a reason to set aside a feud that had never served either family particularly well. Reginald's credibility suffered far more from the failed smear campaign than either of our companies did, and in a strange twist of poetic justice, several clients who had been loyal to the Ashcombe family for years quietly began shifting their business toward companies they now saw as more principled. Watching Nathaniel navigate that crisis, watching him choose honesty and patience over the vengeance that would have been so easy to justify, I understood something I had not fully grasped before, which was the real difference between the two men I had loved. Julian had always chosen the path of least resistance, the path that served his own comfort and desire in the moment, no matter who it hurt, while Nathaniel consistently chose the harder, more honest path, even when it cost him something, even when no one would have blamed him for choosing otherwise. It was in the quiet aftermath of that crisis, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with no particular occasion to mark it, that Nathaniel took my hands in the garden where we had spent so many of our slow, healing afternoons together, and told me that he loved me, not as a replacement for what I had lost, not as a rebound from heartbreak, but as his own complete and separate truth, something he had not expected to find again after his own marriage had ended, and something he did not intend to let go of carelessly. I told him, with a certainty that surprised even me after everything I had been through, that I loved him too, and that for the first time since the wedding that never happened, I felt something other than grief when I imagined my future. We were married the following spring, and I want to tell you honestly that the ceremony looked almost nothing like the one that had been planned for me and Julian, not in its scale, which was smaller and quieter, and not in its spirit, which was steadier and more grounded than anything I had felt walking toward that first altar. We held it in the garden behind Nathaniel's family home, under an arch of white roses that his sister Cordelia had grown herself at her vineyard, with only close family and a handful of true friends in attendance rather than 200 acquaintances gathered as much for spectacle as for celebration. My father walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and when he reached Nathaniel, he did something none of us expected. He embraced him before stepping back, a public acknowledgement of how completely his view of this man, and of the possibility of reconciliation itself, had changed over the course of that difficult, transformative year. I did not wear the dress I had chosen for my first wedding. I chose something new, simpler, a reflection of the person I had become rather than the person I had been when Julian first proposed to me. When I said my vows to Nathaniel, I found that I was not thinking of Julian at all, not out of forced avoidance but because he had genuinely become irrelevant to the story of my happiness, a painful chapter that had, against every reasonable expectation, led me to something far more real than what I had lost. I think often about the strange architecture of that year, how the very worst day of my life, the day I stood humiliated in front of 200 guests in a dress I would never wear again, became the doorway to the truest happiness I have ever known, and how it arrived not from the people I expected comfort from, but from a man I had been raised to think of as an enemy. I have come to believe that this is often how healing works, not in straight lines, not from the sources we anticipate, but sideways, unexpectedly, through cracks we did not know existed until the light came through them. Nathaniel and I have been married for 3 years now, and our two families' companies, once locked in a rivalry that spanned 15 years and untold resources, now collaborate more often than they compete, a partnership built not on the calculations of business strategy but on the harder, more valuable foundation of trust rebuilt from genuine hurt. My father and Nathaniel have grown close in a way that still occasionally surprises me, the two of them disappearing into long conversations about shipping routes and market trends that used to be the language of their rivalry and are now simply the language of family. As for Julian and Vivian, I heard, secondhand and without seeking the information, that their relationship did not survive its second year, that the same capacity for betrayal that brought them together eventually turned inward and pulled them apart, though I want to be honest and tell you that by the time I heard this news, I felt no satisfaction in it, only a distant, quiet peace, the kind that comes from having moved so far beyond someone that their unhappiness no longer has the power to touch you at all. If there is a lesson I would want you to carry away from this story, it is that the people who hurt us most deeply do not get the final word in our lives unless we allow them to, and that sometimes the very worst moment of our lives is not actually the end of our story, but the painful, disorienting beginning of a far better one, arriving in a form we never could have predicted. I want to ask you now, before we close this story together, to think of the lesson that speaks most to your own heart, whether it is about forgiveness, about the courage it takes to trust again after betrayal, about the surprising kindness that can come from unexpected places, or about the quiet strength it takes to stand back up after public humiliation, and I would love for you to leave that reflection in a comment below, because these stories mean so much more when we build meaning from them together, as a community. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that hope can survive even our darkest days, please take a moment to like this video, leave that meaningful comment, share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another one of these emotional journeys. Our family here grows stronger every single time someone new joins us, and I am so grateful, more than words can really express, that you spent this time with me and with Clara's story today. Wherever you are, whatever betrayal or heartbreak you might be carrying right now, I hope you leave this story believing, even just a little more than you did before, that second chances are real, that kindness has a way of finding its way back to those who need it most, and that the very worst chapter of your life might simply be clearing space for the best one you have not yet lived. Thank you for being here, thank you for being part of our community, and I will see you in the next story.